In 2013, a group of cavers squeezed through an 18-centimeter crack in a cliff face in South Africa's cradle of humankind, dropped through a vertical chute in total darkness, and found themselves standing in a chamber 30 meters underground that no one had ever entered before. The floor was covered in bones. Not scattered bones, not a random graveyard. A deliberate, organized accumulation of over 1,500 individual fossil fragments, representing at least 15 different people, from infants to the elderly, all from the same species. No other animals, no tools, no signs of habitation, just bodies, carried deep into the earth in permanent darkness and left there, by a creature with a brain, a third the size of yours. That creature now has a name, Homo naledi, and it is only one of 10 fossils on this list that scientists cannot explain, cannot classify, and cannot fit into any version of human history we have ever written. Here is what we think we know about human evolution. We evolved from ape-like ancestors in Africa. Our brain got bigger over time. Our behavior got more sophisticated. Modern humans eventually won. End of story. Except it is not the end. Because the fossil record keeps producing things that do not belong in that story at all. Creatures from the wrong time with the wrong anatomy doing things they were not supposed to be capable of. Species that look like they descended from 3 different ancestors simultaneously. An entire human lineage known for a decade only from a single finger bone, with no face, no skull, no name. A hobbit-sized human on an Indonesian island whose brain was too small to account for the sophisticated tools found beside it. And a skull hidden in a well in China for 85 years that, when it finally reached scientists, turned out to be the most important piece of the puzzle anyone had been missing. Every one of these fossils broke the model when it was found. Most of them still have not been fully explained. And taken together, they point toward a version of human prehistory that is less like a family tree and more like a jungle, dark, tangled, and full of things we have not identified yet. The story of the cave in South Africa. In October of 2013, a recreational caver named Rick Hunter was exploring a system of underground passages in Gauteng province when he found himself in a narrow horizontal tunnel that opened without warning into empty space. He shone his headlamp downward. The chamber below him was filled with fossil bones. He photographed them and brought the images to Lee Berger, a paleoanthropologist at the University of the Witwatersrand. What Berger saw in those photographs made him immediately plan an excavation. But the problem was physical. The passage leading to the chamber was one of the most restrictive in any known cave system. At its narrowest point, the slot was 18 centimeters wide. The only researchers small enough to pass through it were slender women. Berger assembled a team of 6 female scientists and called them the underground astronauts. They rappelled down into the darkness, set up an excavation grid, and began recovering what would become the largest collection of a single hominin species ever found on the African continent, 1,550 specimens. 737 anatomical elements, parts of virtually every bone in the body, from multiple individuals of both sexes and all age groups, from newborn infants to elderly adults. This was not luck. This was a population, and every single bone belonged to the same previously unknown species. They named it Homo naledi. Naledi means star in Sotho. They named it after the cave system, the rising star. And then the problems started. The first problem was anatomy. Homo naledi did not look like any single hominin species. Its skull was small, disturbingly small. The males had a brain volume of roughly 560 cubic centimeters. The females were closer to 465. For comparison, Homo erectus averaged around 900. Modern humans average around 1,270. Homo naledi's brain was closer in size to species that lived 2 million years ago in Africa. Its skull shape, its thick brow ridge, its low forehead, all pointed backward, toward the deep past. But below the neck, everything changed. The hands were nearly human. The wrist bones were nearly human. The feet were nearly human. The gait was nearly human. If you covered the skull and watched Homo naledi walk across a field, you might mistake its stride for that of a short modern person. Paleoanthropologists could not reconcile this. They had a creature with an ancient head and a modern body. Every system for classifying hominin evolution required that features like these develop together along a coherent line. Homo naledi refused to cooperate. The second problem was age. When the fossils were first announced in 2015, no one could date them. The cave environment had made conventional dating methods unreliable. Speculation placed them anywhere from 1 million years ago to 100,000. Most researchers assumed they were ancient because everything about the anatomy looked ancient. A small-brained hominin could not have survived that recently in Africa alongside bigger-brained competitors. It simply did not fit the model. Then the dating results came back in 2017. Homo naledi had been alive between 236,000 and 335,000 years ago. They had walked the Earth at the same time as early modern humans. A creature with a brain that belonged to the Pleistocene dawn had coexisted with the species looking at its bones 2.5 million years later. The model did not just crack, it shattered. But the third problem was the worst, and it is the one that scientists are still arguing about today. The bodies in the cave had been placed there deliberately. Everything about the physical environment rules out accident. The Dinaledi chamber sits 80 meters inside a cave system that has always been in total darkness. There is no evidence that water ever flooded the chamber at sufficient force to carry bodies. There is no evidence that predators dragged the remains there. There are no carnivore tooth marks on the bones. There are no bones from any other species. Just the people of Homo naledi, deposited across multiple separate excavation areas, in positions consistent with bodies that were covered quickly by sediment while still intact. Berger and his team published their conclusion in 2023. Cultural burial, the deliberate placement of the dead. They also found what appears to be a single stone artifact positioned near one of the burials in a way that has no natural explanation. If they are right, Homo naledi was burying its dead more than 100,000 years before the oldest confirmed Homo sapiens burial. They were doing it with a brain 1/3 the size of yours. They were doing it in permanent darkness, in a cave only accessible through passages that would have required controlled fire and cooperative behavior to navigate. The consensus response from the paleoanthropology community was not celebration, it was skepticism. Critics argued the burial interpretation was premature. They pointed to the limited involvement of outside experts in the initial excavation. They questioned whether the stone artifact was genuinely placed or simply fell there. The debate became public, sharp, and personal. This is how it always goes when a fossil refuses to behave. What nobody disputes is what the bones actually say. A species with an ancient-looking brain managed to survive in southern Africa for hundreds of thousands of years, alongside cognitively modern humans, apparently developed sophisticated mortuary behavior, and left its dead in a cave system that required planning and cooperation to even reach. Homo naledi should not have lasted that long. It should not have been capable of what the evidence suggests it was capable of. There is no clean explanation. There is only the cave, the bones, and the darkness. Now let us go to an island. In 2003, on the Indonesian island of Flores, a joint Australian and Indonesian research team was excavating a large cave called Liang Bua, which translates to cool cave, when they uncovered the partial skeleton of a small adult female. She was approximately 30 years old when she died. She stood 1 meter and 5 centimeters tall. Her brain volume was approximately 420 cubic centimeters, smaller than a chimpanzee's, and she had used stone tools to hunt and butcher pygmy elephants. They gave her the species name Homo floresiensis. The press gave her a different name immediately. They called her the Hobbit. The tools found with her were not simple. They were worked and shaped. They required planning and cognitive capacity to manufacture. The stegodon elephant bones in the same cave layer showed cut marks from those tools. And later analysis revealed that the Flores hominins had also been coping with Komodo dragons, the largest lizards on Earth, as predators sharing their environment. The tiny-brained creature had been surviving against giant reptiles, hunting island elephants, and manufacturing stone implements. According to everything known about brain size and behavior in primates, this should not have been possible. The scientific community split almost immediately into two camps. One side accepted Homo floresiensis as a genuine new species, likely descended from Homo erectus, and shrunk by a process called island dwarfism, in which isolated populations on small islands evolve smaller bodies over generations due to limited food resources. The other side argued the bones belonged to a pathological modern human, someone who had suffered from microcephaly, a developmental disorder that causes abnormally small brain size, or from Laron syndrome, a growth deficiency condition. The battle escalated into one of the ugliest disputes in the modern history of paleoanthropology. A senior Indonesian scientist named Tuku Jacob, who held authority over fossil access in the country, took the original Liangbua bones without the permission of the discovery team and held them for 3 months. When the fossils were returned in early 2005, the discovery team found them damaged. The pelvis had been cracked. The mandible was missing an incisor. Reconstructed areas had been altered. The researchers who had spent years working on the bones were now looking at a different set of bones. The microcephaly argument eventually failed on the evidence. Not one microcephalic individual in the modern medical literature has the combination of skeletal features shown by Homo floresiensis across multiple individuals from the same site. By 2015, partial skeletons of at least 14 additional individuals had been recovered from the cave. Every one of them showed the same diminutive proportions. The species designation held, the question of ancestry did not. Homo floresiensis's brain size was, by any mathematical model, too small to have been derived from Homo erectus through island dwarfism alone. For the brain to have shrunk that dramatically, the body would have had to shrink to the size of a doll. Some researchers proposed instead that Homo floresiensis descended from an earlier, already small species that had left Africa long before Homo erectus, possibly Homo habilis, or something even older. The problem is that no evidence of any such pre-erectus migration has ever been found. It requires an entire chapter of human dispersal that left no other trace anywhere. In 2016, fossil teeth and a jawbone were found at a separate site on Flores called Mata Menge, 70 kilometers from Liangbua. They were dated to 700,000 years ago, 3 times older than the Liangbua fossils, and they belong to a hominin even smaller than the hobbit. If the Flores lineage had been on the island for 700,000 years, the mystery of how it got there becomes even harder to solve. Something crossed open water to reach an island that was never connected to a landmass and has never, at any point in the geological record, been reachable without a sea crossing of significant distance. No one knows how Homo floresiensis got to Flores. No one knows where it came from. No DNA has been successfully extracted from any specimen, so genetic analysis is not available. The species is simply there, on the fossil record, using stone tools, surviving against giant lizards, with a brain too small for any of it to have been possible, on an island it should never have been able to reach. Local legends on Flores speak of a small, hairy, cave-dwelling creature called the Ebu-Gogo. The stories are old. Some researchers have suggested the hobbits may have survived long enough in other parts of the island to enter oral tradition. The current scientific consensus places their extinction around 50,000 years ago, coinciding roughly with the arrival of anatomically modern humans in the region. Whether they met, whether they interacted, whether one drove the other to extinction, no evidence has confirmed any of it. All we know is that something was on that island for hundreds of thousands of years that should not have been there at all. Now let us cross the Pacific and look at a skull. In 1933, a Chinese laborer named Wang Jiaji was building a bridge over the Songhua River in the city of Harbin, in what was then the Japanese-controlled territory of Manchukuo. While excavating the riverbank, he found a human skull in the sediment. It was enormous. It was extraordinarily well preserved. He recognized it as important, possibly as a consequence of widespread public interest in the Peking man fossils that had been announced just 4 years earlier. He did not want to hand it to the Japanese authorities. So he wrapped it, carried it home, and hid it in an abandoned well. The skull sat at the bottom of that well for the next 85 years. Wang Jiazi never retrieved it. He died without ever telling anyone where it was. The secret passed to his grandson, who kept it until he was very old. In 2018, as he was dying, the grandson revealed the location to his family. The skull was recovered from the well and donated to Hebei Geo University. In 2021, A team of Chinese and international scientists published their analysis in the journal The Innovation. The skull was at least 146,000 years old. It was the largest Homo skull ever recorded. The brain volume was 1,420 cubic centimeters, well within the modern human range. But the architecture was wrong. The brow ridges were massive. The eye sockets were nearly square. The mouth was wide enough to accommodate teeth twice the size of yours. The face was flat in a way more reminiscent of modern humans than of Neanderthals or Homo erectus. But everything else about the skull looked like something from a far earlier epoch. The team compared 600 separate morphological characteristics of the skull against 95 other hominin specimens. Their conclusion was that this skull did not fit any existing species. They named it Homo longi, Dragon Man. They proposed that the Dragon Man lineage was actually more closely related to modern Homo sapiens than Neanderthals were, which would require rewriting the branch of the human family tree that had been accepted for decades. The announcement created immediate controversy. The skull had no confirmed provenance. No one could say with absolute certainty where Wang Jiaji had found it along the riverbank. It had been handled by collectors and researchers for years before reaching scientists, contaminating any surface DNA. Critics argued the species designation was premature. One paleoanthropologist noted, with some degree of frustration, that naming a new species from a fossil with no confirmed location, no associated remains, and no clean stratigraphic context was scientifically questionable. But then, in 2025, something happened that changed everything. A geneticist named Chao Mei Fu, working at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, had spent years trying to extract DNA from Dragon Man without success. The skull's dense bone and teeth had yielded nothing, so she tried something different. She scraped fossilized dental plaque, called dental calculus, from the root of the skull's single remaining molar. Hardened plaque preserves genetic material in a way that bone often does not. It is, as one Harvard researcher described it, like a tiny time capsule sealed against the outside world. The plaque yielded mitochondrial DNA, and the mitochondrial DNA matched the Denisovans. This requires a brief explanation. The Denisovans are a human species whose entire known existence rested, for its first 15 years, on a fragment of a little finger bone found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia in 2010. The cave was called Denisova. A team led by geneticist Svante Parbo extracted DNA from the bone and discovered that it did not match Neanderthals, did not match modern humans, and did not match any known species. It was something else entirely. A third lineage of humans, previously unknown to science, living in Asia at the same time as Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. The Denisovans interbred with modern humans. Their DNA survives in living people today, concentrated in populations across East and Southeast Asia, and reaching its highest levels in Papua New Guinea and Aboriginal Australians, where it can account for up to 5% of the genome. Hundreds of millions of people walking the earth right now carry the DNA of a species that, for 15 years, had no face, no skull, no known appearance. Scientists knew the Denisovans existed. They knew what the Denisovans ate from sediment samples. They knew where the Denisovans traveled from traces in living people's genetics. They just did not know what a Denisovan looked like. Dragon Man was the answer. After 15 years of searching, the Denisovans finally had a skull. They had a face. They had a brain size. They had square eye sockets and a massive brow ridge and oversized teeth, and they had been alive at least 146,000 years ago in northeastern China, hunting and fishing in a forested floodplain environment, living in small groups. And they had been sitting at the bottom of a well in Harbin since before the Second World War. The taxonomic argument continues. Some scientists argue Dragon Man should remain Homo longi. Others say it should simply be called Homo sapiens denisoviensis, a subspecies of our own lineage, given the evidence of interbreeding. Others prefer to keep using the informal name Denisovan, precisely because the question of whether they constitute a distinct species or a subspecies remains genuinely unresolved. What none of them dispute is that the skull from the well in Harbin is now the most complete Denisovan fossil ever found. And it arrived in science not from a controlled excavation, but from the bottom of a well, because a laborer trusted his instincts on a riverbank in Manchukuo 92 years ago. We have not finished with China. In 1989, an archaeologist named Zhang Xingyun was excavating a cave in Yunnan province in southwest China called Maludong, or Red Deer Cave. The cave floor contained lenses of ancient ash from campfires, burned bones of giant red deer, and human skeletal fragments. The human remains were set aside for later analysis, while the team focused on stratigraphy and context. When radiocarbon dating was eventually conducted on the sediment, the results produced a figure that was hard to accept. The human bones from Red Deer Cave were approximately 14,000 years old. 14,000 years ago, Homo sapiens had already been present across much of Asia for tens of thousands of years. Agriculture was about to begin transforming southern China. This was essentially modern historical time, in evolutionary terms. And the people in this cave looked nothing like modern humans. The Maludong skull had a rounded, short brain case. The forehead was flat and sloping, more like Homo erectus than like any living person. The brow ridges were prominent. The face was broad. The brain appeared smaller than the modern human average. When paleoanthropologists compared the skull to reference specimens, the closest match was not to any Homo sapiens population, living or ancient. It was to specimens from 1.5 to 2 million years ago, Homo erectus, and even Homo habilis from early Pleistocene Africa. A similar skull was recovered from a second site called Longlin Cave in the neighboring province of Guangxi. Together, the two sets of remains were formally announced in 2012 as the Red Deer Cave people. The announcement generated worldwide attention and immediate argument. One faction proposed the Red Deer Cave people were a late surviving archaic human lineage, possibly Denisovans, or a related population that had persisted in the isolated valleys of southwest China until almost modern times. Another faction proposed they were a hybrid population, the result of interbreeding between archaic humans and incoming modern Homo sapiens. A third faction dismissed the whole thing as overinterpretation of a group of robustly built early modern humans, arguing the unusual features were within the known range of human variation. A second discovery deepened the case. In 2015, a thigh bone recovered from the Red Deer Cave excavation was finally analyzed in detail. Its anatomy was consistent with early Homo erectus or Homo habilis. Its owner would have weighed around 50 kilograms and stood short by any standard. In functional and morphological terms, the bone was indistinguishable from remains nearly 2 million years old. The bone was 14,000 years old. Ancient DNA eventually reached the Red Deer Cave material in 2022. Chinese scientists extracted a partial genome from the best-preserved skull and published their results. The individual was female. Her genome placed her firmly within the East Asian ancestry of modern humans, consistent with living populations in the region and with ancestral Native Americans. There was no evidence of deep archaic ancestry from any unknown lineage. So they were modern humans, anatomically modern Homo sapiens, by genetics, living 14,000 years ago in southern China, with skulls that looked like something from 2 million years earlier. The archaeology explained nothing. The genetics explained nothing. The morphology made no sense. The researchers who confirmed the modern human DNA were careful to note that the unusual features of the Red Deer Cave people remain unexplained. A living population of people, genetically indistinguishable from the ancestors of East Asians and Native Americans, had a skull shape that fit no known modern population and resembled archaic ancestors from epochs before the genus Homo was fully established. One hypothesis is that an early group of Homo sapiens migrated out of Africa more than 100,000 years ago, isolated in southern China, and diverged morphologically from the main line in ways that DNA alone cannot capture. Another hypothesis is that the range of physical variation in ancient Homo sapiens was dramatically wider than the variation seen in people alive today, and that the Red Deer Cave people represent an extreme expression of that range. Neither hypothesis has been confirmed. The people of Red Deer Cave remain exactly what they were when their bones were first recovered in 1989, a population from the wrong time with the wrong anatomy that no category in human evolution has been built to contain. Now we go to Spain, in the Sierra de Atapuerca, a system of limestone caves in northern Spain near the city of Burgos. A vertical shaft drops roughly 14 meters into a chamber that researchers have named the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of the bones. At the bottom of the pit, underneath decades of accumulated sediment, archaeologists beginning in the 1970s gradually uncovered one of the most extraordinary assemblages of hominin fossils ever found, the remains of at least 28 individuals, comprising over 6,500 bones, all deposited approximately 400,000 years ago. The people of the Cima were large. Adult males stood around 1.75 meters. They had massive brow ridges, elongated skulls, and the early signs of a facial structure that would eventually characterize the Neanderthals of Europe. Their anatomy was so classically Neanderthal-like that when analysis began, many researchers assumed they were an early Neanderthal population. The site also contained a single hand axe made of red quartzite, a striking and impractical material for a tool, found with no signs of practical use, that may represent the earliest example of a symbolic or ritual object ever recovered. The bones showed no carnivore damage. No other animals were found in the pit. The only way into the chamber was a vertical drop of 14 meters. Whatever carried those 28 people into the darkness 400,000 years ago had done so deliberately. This is the oldest convincingly argued case for deliberate disposal of the dead in the human fossil record, and it predates Homo naledi's burial behavior by roughly 100,000 years. Then came the DNA. In 2013, a team at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology extracted mitochondrial DNA from one of the Cima de los Huesos individuals. The result was completely unexpected. The DNA did not match Neanderthals. It matched Denisovans. The people in the pit looked like Neanderthals. Their anatomy, their skull shape, their facial structure, their body size, all pointed toward the Neanderthal lineage with extraordinary consistency. But their mitochondrial DNA was Denisovan. The two lineages that scientists had considered separate, geographically distinct populations, one in Europe and one in Asia, were somehow genetically mingled in a pit in northern Spain 400,000 years ago. Later, nuclear DNA analysis partially clarified the picture. The nuclear genome of the Cima individuals was closer to Neanderthals than to Denisovans. The mitochondrial signal, which passes only through the mother, may have come from an earlier wave of population mixing, a Denisovan or Denisovan-related group that interbred with the ancestors of the Cima people before they arrived in Spain. The people in the pit may have looked like Neanderthals, carried Neanderthal nuclear genes, and still inherited their mitochondrial heritage from a population that spread across Asia and left traces in Siberian caves. Human evolution in the Middle Pleistocene was not a story of isolated lineages developing separately on different continents. It was a story of constant movement, constant contact, constant interbreeding, and constant genetic exchange between populations that we have been trying to sort into neat species boxes ever since. The Cima de los Huesos still has not yielded all its secrets. Excavations continue. The site has produced teeth, skulls, limb bones, and an almost complete pelvis, along with evidence suggesting the 28 individuals may have been deposited over a period of time rather than in a single event. What brought them there? Who brought them? What did the red quartzite hand axe mean to the people who placed it at the bottom of the pit? The symbolic behavior that culminates in modern human art and religion had to start somewhere. The Cima may be where it started. In 2019, a cave on the island of Luzon in the northern Philippines yielded something new. Luzon is the largest island in the Philippines. It has been inhabited by modern humans for roughly 50,000 years. But in Callao Cave, in an excavation led by Florent Detroit of the National Museum of Natural History in Paris, researchers found 12 fossil bones from at least 3 individuals that could not be assigned to any known hominin species. They named the species Homo luzonensis. The bones are small, consistent with a short individual, but the features distributed across those 12 elements come from wildly different chapters of hominin evolution. The foot bones resemble those of Australopithecus, the genus that lived in Africa 3 to 4 million years ago. The finger bones are curved in a way associated with climbing behavior in very ancient hominins. The teeth combine primitive premolar shapes with more modern molar configurations that have no precedent anywhere in the fossil record. No single known species, and no known pathway of evolution, would produce that particular combination of traits in the same body. The bones date to at least 50,000 years ago, but some of the anatomical features they display are associated with lineages that had been extinct in Africa for millions of years before that date. Homo luzonensis is not supposed to exist on Luzon at all. Like Homo floresiensis on Flores, it is on an island that was never connected to a continent. It got there across open water, and when it arrived, or what it descended from, or how long it had been there, are all completely unknown, because the fossil record on Luzon for the relevant period is essentially empty. Detractors have questioned whether 12 fragmentary bones are sufficient to establish a new species. The discoverers point to the unique combination of traits as impossible to explain any other way. The debate is ongoing. The bones remain in Kalau Cave, waiting for more context that may or may not arrive. Luzon, like Flores, like the Rising Star Cave in South Africa, is another reminder that islands and caves have preserved things the mainland swallowed. The remote, the inaccessible, the forgotten corners of geography are where the anomalies accumulate. The creatures that should not have been there, doing things they should not have been able to do, leaving bones that no classification system has been built to hold. Now let us go back to the cave that started this. The Rising Star system in South Africa did not give up its secrets all at once. After the initial Dinaledi chamber excavations ended in 2014, a separate team exploring a different passage more than 100 meters away discovered another chamber, the Lesedi chamber. It contained another collection of Homo naledi remains. Again, no other species. Again, no signs of habitation. Again, bodies placed there deliberately. The most complete specimen from the Lesedi chamber is a nearly complete skull and partial skeleton of a large male. His brain volume was 610 cubic centimeters, the largest known for Homo naledi, still dramatically smaller than Homo sapiens, still belonging anatomically to a world millions of years before his actual date of existence. They gave him a name, Neo. It means gift in Sotho. Neo's hands suggest fine motor control. His feet suggest walking efficiency comparable to modern humans. His wrist bones are structured in a way associated with tool use. The mosaic in his skeleton, ancient skull attached to modern limbs, is even clearer in Neo than in the Dinaledi specimens. It is as though evolution built different parts of him from different eras, assembled them in the same body, and released them into a world that should already have replaced them. The burial evidence from the Rising Star system builds with each new excavation. Articulated skeletal regions. Bodies covered quickly by sediment before soft tissue could decompose. The same chamber used repeatedly across what may have been an extended period. And then the engraved marks. In the passages approaching what Berger and his team call a possible burial chamber, cross-hatched marks have been found engraved into the rock surfaces. If deliberate, they may represent the earliest symbolic engravings ever found, created by a species with a brain smaller than a chimpanzee's. The scientific community remains divided, but the evidence accumulates. And the question that the evidence forces is one that most of the discipline has been reluctant to confront directly. If Homo naledi was burying its dead, and possibly creating symbolic marks on rock walls with a brain 1/3 the size of ours, then what does brain size actually tell us about cognitive capacity? What does it mean for our entire theory of how and when symbolic behavior developed in our lineage? Everything we thought we knew about the relationship between brain size and behavior assumed that intelligence scaled with cranial volume. The evidence from the Rising Star cave system suggests that assumption is wrong. It has always been wrong. It was comfortable, it was neat, and the bones underneath South Africa are undoing it one chamber at a time. Let us now return to the caves where the Denisovans were first discovered and follow what happened next. In 2010, the only evidence that the Denisovans existed was a fragment of the fifth finger of a right hand. The cave at Denisova in the Altai Mountains of Siberia had been excavated for years, and the fragmentary nature of the finds from that layer was not unusual. Small bones get preserved, big bones get scattered. The research team sent the finger fragment to Svante Pääbo's lab at the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig. What came back was the news that changed everything. The DNA was human. But it was not Homo sapiens DNA. It was not Neanderthal DNA. It was something third, something that shared a common ancestor with both, but had diverged from that ancestor far enough to constitute a separate lineage. The creature from the Denisova cave pinky bone had last shared an ancestor with Neanderthals roughly 400,000 years ago, and with modern humans around 800,000 years ago. It had been living in southern Siberia at the same time as both. Over the years that followed, additional Denisovan material emerged from the cave in small pieces. A molar so large it was initially identified as belonging to a cave bear. A second molar, also enormous. A fragmentary toe bone, a rib fragment. The physical remains were minimal, but the genetic signal was precise. The Denisovans had interbred with anatomically modern humans at least twice, possibly more. One major pulse of interbreeding occurred in Southeast Asia. Another occurred somewhere in East Asia or South Asia. The descendants of those encounters are alive today. The Xiahe mandible, a jawbone found in a Tibetan cave at an elevation of over 3,000 meters and dated to 160,000 years ago, was identified as Denisovan through protein analysis in 2019. It showed that Denisovans had already adapted to high-altitude, low-oxygen environments by at least that date. The gene variant that allows modern Tibetans to survive at altitude, a genetic adaptation found nowhere else on Earth, is inherited from the Denisovans. It is one of the clearest examples of an ancient human's biological legacy actively keeping their descendants alive today. A jawbone from the seafloor off the coast of Taiwan, dredged up by fishing nets and dated to at least 10,000 years ago, was also identified as likely Denisovan. If confirmed, it extends the known range of the species to the Pacific Ocean's edge and raises the possibility that Denisovans were maritime or coastal populations, capable of the same kinds of island crossings that deposited Homo floresiensis on Oke, Flores and Homo luzonensis on Luzon. All of this, the Tibetan high-altitude gene, the Pacific coastal presence, the massive brain size implied by Dragon Man's skull, the genetic traces in living populations from Siberia to Papua New Guinea, accumulated from a single finger bone. For 15 years, the most widespread and genetically successful archaic human population in Asia was known only from a fragment small enough to fit in a matchbox. Now let us stand back and look at what all 10 of these fossils are actually telling us. The version of human evolution taught for most of the 20th century was a ladder, apes at the bottom, Australopithecines in the middle, Homo erectus above them, archaic Homo above that, modern Homo sapiens at the top. A clean progressive sequence, one species replacing the last, each generation smarter, more capable, more victorious. The ladder had a direction and a destination, and the destination was us. Every fossil on this list is a contradiction of that model. Homo naledi survived for hundreds of thousands of years, alongside cognitively modern humans, despite having a brain from a far older era. Homo floresiensis was on an island it should not have reached, using tools its brain should not have been capable of producing, for 700,000 years. Dragon Man's skull sat in a well for 85 years before revealing that an entire human lineage had been looking for its own face in the wrong places. The Red Deer cave people were modern humans with archaic skulls living after agriculture was invented. The Cima de los Huesos people looked like Neanderthals and had Denisovan DNA. Homo luzonensis had a body assembled from evolutionary traits separated by millions of years. The Denisovans left their genetics in hundreds of millions of living people before scientists had any idea what they looked like. Human evolution was not a ladder, it was a network, multiple lineages developing simultaneously, meeting, separating, interbreeding, sharing genes, competing, coexisting, dying out, sometimes persisting in unexpected corners of the Earth long after every model predicted their extinction. The boundaries between species were not clean. The capabilities associated with brain size were not predictable. The geography was not orderly. And the most unsettling part of all this is not what we have found. It is what we have not found yet. The Denisovans were a major human lineage, known only from a pinky bone for a decade and a half. Their range extended from Siberia to the Tibetan Plateau to the coast of the Pacific Ocean, and they interbred with modern humans multiple times on multiple continents. They were everywhere, and we found the first confirmed evidence of their existence in a child's finger bone. How many other lineages are there that we have not found at all? How many creatures walked through the last few 100,000 years of human history, contributed their DNA to the populations alive today, and left nothing behind in the fossil record that we have yet identified? Every cave that gets excavated now, every fragment of bone that gets sent to a laboratory capable of ancient DNA analysis, has the potential to reveal another branch on the family network that we did not know existed. The history written in bones is fragmentary by nature. Fossilization is rare. Preservation is rarer. Recovery is rarer still. The 1150 Homo naledi fossils found in the Rising Star Cave represent one of the richest single-species deposits in African paleoanthropology, and they were hidden 30 meters underground in a chamber, accessible only through an 18-centimeter gap in the rock. Had a pair of specific recreational cavers not taken a specific route on a specific day in October 2013, those bones would still be in the dark. What is still in the dark? What is still in wells, in caves, in seafloor sediment, in excavation sites that have not been funded, in remote valleys that have never been surveyed? The Red Deer Cave people were found in 1989 and not fully analyzed for over 2 decades. Dragon Man was found in 1933 and not given to scientists until 85 years later. The Cima de los Huesos has been excavated since the 1970s and is still producing significant material. The fossil record is not a closed book. It is a manuscript that keeps adding pages, and every new page revises what came before. The version of human history that will be written 50 years from now will likely be as different from the version we have today as today's version is from what was believed in 1950. New species will be named. Old species will be collapsed into others. Entire lineages will be discovered from a tooth or a jawbone or a fragment of hardened dental plaque. What all 10 of these fossils share is that they were found when nobody expected them. The Hobbit turned up in a cave that archaeologists had been excavating for other reasons. Dragon Man came from the bottom of a well someone's grandfather dug out of an instinct for preservation. The Denisovans announced themselves through a finger bone in a cave in Siberia that had been studied for decades without yielding anything especially remarkable. Homo naledi revealed itself through a gap in the rock that could have been passed by every caver who had been through the Rising Star system before Rick Hunter decided to squeeze through it on that October afternoon. The next revelation is already out there. It is waiting in sediment, or in a well, or at the bottom of a shaft that no one has yet thought to descend. It will upend something we believe with confidence. It will require another revision to the version of human history that we are teaching right now. And when it arrives, it will be announced with the same characteristic mixture of astonishment and argument, the same debates about species names and burial interpretations and brain sizes and what was or was not possible. Because that is what the fossil record does. It does not confirm what we think, it unsettles it. Every bone that comes out of the ground is an argument from the past about what the past actually was. And the past, it turns out, was considerably stranger, considerably more crowded, and considerably more interesting than anyone standing at the top of the ladder ever imagined. If this video gave you something to think about, the subscribe button is down below. There is more where this came from.